There's a city at the bottom of the Black Sea. Not a ruin, not scattered stones worn smooth by currents. An actual city. Streets intact. Houses standing. Wooden beams that should have rotted away 7,000 years ago, preserved perfectly in the lightless, oxygen-starved water 300 feet down. The fishing nets are still there, hanging where someone left them one morning, probably thinking they'd come back that afternoon. They never came back. Nobody came back, because in a span of time so short it barely registers in geological records, the entire world of these people was swallowed by the sea. Their fields, their villages, their holy places, thousands of square miles of coastline, all of it drowned under hundreds of feet of salt water that came roaring through the Bosphorus Strait like a tsunami that never stopped. For decades, this was just a story, a legend, another version of the flood myth that appears in practically every ancient culture from Mesopotamia to the Americas. Noah and his ark, Gilgamesh and his boat, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology, all describing the same thing, a catastrophic deluge that reshaped the world. Myths, that's what archaeologists called them. Poetic explanations for things ancient peoples didn't understand. Cultural memories mixed with religious symbolism. Then, in 1997, two marine geologists named William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a theory that changed everything. They proposed that around 5,600 BCE, something genuinely apocalyptic happened at the Black Sea. The Mediterranean, swollen with meltwater from retreating glaciers, finally breached the natural barrier at the Bosphorus. What followed was a flood of such magnitude it would have been visible from space. We're not talking about rising water levels over centuries. We're talking about a waterfall 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, pouring into what was then a freshwater lake, raising sea levels by inches per day, drowning 60,000 square miles of inhabited coastline in less than a year. At first, the scientific community was skeptical. Sure, it was a compelling theory. Yes, the geological evidence supported a sudden flooding event, but proof, actual physical evidence of the civilizations that would have been destroyed, that was harder to find. Until they started looking beneath the waves. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time. I love checking comments. Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all listening to the same drowned cities. What they found down there defied expectations. The Black Sea's unique chemistry, its anoxic depths where almost no oxygen exists, created a time capsule unlike anything else on Earth. Wood doesn't rot. Metal doesn't corrode as quickly. Even organic materials that would normally disappear within decades have lasted for millennia. Ancient shipwrecks sit on the seafloor, with their masts still standing, their rigging still attached. Archaeologists found a Greek trading vessel from 400 BCE in such pristine condition you can see the rope marks where sailors tied off the sails. The oldest intact shipwreck ever discovered, looking like it sank last year, not 2,400 years ago. But the ships are just the beginning. Using sonar scanning and underwater robots, research teams have mapped entire settlements. Stone walls marking property boundaries, the remnants of wooden structures perfectly preserved in the cold, dark water, channels that were once rivers now submerged, ancient beaches now 500 feet below the surface, and artifacts, tools, pottery, the everyday objects of people who had no idea they were living on borrowed time. What makes this discovery so haunting is the scale of it. This wasn't a village. It wasn't even a region. It was an entire civilization's worth of coastal settlements, all drowned simultaneously. Hundreds of communities, maybe thousands, gone in less than a generation. Picture it. You're a farmer living on the shores of what you know as a freshwater lake. Maybe you've noticed the water tastes different lately. Maybe you've seen it creeping higher up the beach, But then one morning you wake up and the sea has swallowed your neighbour's house. By evening, it's at your door. By the next day, you're running inland with whatever you can carry, watching your entire world disappear beneath the waves behind you. Some didn't run, some couldn't. And now they're down there too, in the drowned cities, in the houses that became their tombs. This is the story of the Black Sea's buried coasts, of the people who lived there, who died there, who left behind a perfectly preserved snapshot of life at the edge of catastrophe, of the scientist who found them, and of what this discovery means for our understanding of ancient history, climate change, and the flood myths that humanity has been telling for 7,000 years. Because it turns out, they weren't myths at all. They were memories. 12,000 years ago, the Black Sea wasn't a sea at all. It was a lake, an enormous freshwater lake sitting 500 feet below where the surface is today. Picture it. A body of water roughly the size of modern California, completely isolated from the Mediterranean, completely isolated from the oceans. Its shores were lush, temperate, perfect, and people lived there. They had no idea they were living in a place that would one day become a tomb. The lake they knew wasn't like the hostile, nearly lifeless sea that exists today. Modern Black Sea water is stratified, with a layer of toxic hydrogen sulfide below about 150 meters that kills almost everything. But the ancient lake was different. It was oxygenated all the way to the bottom. Fish thrived in its waters. Freshwater species we can identify from sediment cores. Pike, perch, sturgeon. The kind of fish you could catch with simple nets and feed a family for days. The shores were even better. Because here's what matters about the end of the Ice Age. It wasn't just that glaciers melted and sea levels rose. The climate was transforming. Temperatures were stabilizing at levels that were actually ideal for human habitation. Not too hot, not too cold. The regions around this ancient lake experienced what we'd now call a Mediterranean climate. Warm summers, mild winters, reliable rainfall. This created something remarkable, an ecosystem that was basically a Neolithic paradise. The lake provided abundant fresh water, which sounds obvious, but think about what that meant. No salt contamination, no tidal fluctuations destroying settlements, just consistent drinkable water as far as the eye could see. The surrounding lands were covered in mixed forests, oak, beech, hornbeam. These weren't impenetrable jungles. They were open woodlands interspersed with meadows, perfect for both wild game and early agriculture, and people definitely noticed. Archaeological evidence from the regions that are now underwater shows clear signs of Neolithic settlement. Not just temporary camps, but permanent communities. We're talking about people who had made the revolutionary transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. They were growing wheat and barley. They were domesticating animals, sheep, goats, probably cattle. They were building structures meant to last. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Sediment cores pulled from the Black Sea floor contain pollen signatures that tell us exactly what plants were growing around the ancient lake. The pollen doesn't lie. It shows cultivated grains appearing in the record around 9,000 years ago. It shows clearance of forests, probably for agriculture. It shows the unmistakable signature of human landscape modification. But the really compelling evidence comes from the ancient coastline itself. See, when the flood came and the lake level rose, it didn't just cover the old shores, it preserved them. Under hundreds of feet of water protected from erosion and weathering, those ancient beaches and coastal plains have remained remarkably intact. And when marine archaeologists finally figured out how to survey them properly in the late 20th century, they found something extraordinary. Structures. We're not talking about crude shelters. These were sophisticated buildings, stone foundations, post holes indicating wooden superstructures, storage pits for grain, hearths for cooking, all the markers of permanent settlement. Some sites show evidence of multiple occupation phases, meaning people lived there for generations, building, rebuilding, improving their homes over decades or centuries. The settlements weren't random either. They show systematic planning, houses clustered together for mutual protection, shared spaces that might have been communal work areas or gathering places, defensive positioning on high, ground overlooking the lake. These people were thinking long-term. They were creating communities, not just surviving day to day, and they were thriving. The combination of lake fishing, agricultural production, and hunting in the surrounding forests created an economic system that could support relatively large populations. We can estimate from settlement patterns that some communities might have numbered in the hundreds. That's huge for the Neolithic period. Most contemporary settlements elsewhere were tiny, maybe 20 or 30 people. But the ancient Black Sea shores had resources to spare. The fishing alone would have been extraordinary. Modern fisheries in freshwater lakes show that well-managed stocks can provide enormous yields. The ancient lake, with no industrial pollution and abundant food sources for fish, would have been incredibly productive. Seasonal fish runs, probably spawning migrations up the rivers that fed the lake, would have provided predictable surges of food that communities could harvest and preserve. They developed the technology to exploit this abundance. Archaeological sites yield fishing equipment, bone hooks, stone weights for nets, harpoon points. This wasn't casual fishing. This was systematic resource extraction. They understood fish behavior, seasonal patterns, migration routes. They were proto-marine biologists, learning through observation and experience how to maximize their catch. The agricultural component was equally sophisticated. By 8,000 years ago, the communities around the ancient Black Sea had fully domesticated versions of wheat, barley, and probably several legumes. This wasn't just planting wild seeds and hoping for the best. This was selective breeding, choosing the best plants year after year until they created crops that were more productive and easier to harvest than anything found in nature. They had pottery too, ceramic vessels for storage, cooking, serving food. Some fragments recovered from sites show decorative patterns, suggesting these weren't just functional objects but expressions of cultural identity. Different communities developed distinctive styles, ways of decorating their pottery that identified them as belonging to specific groups. This tells us something profound. These people had moved beyond subsistence. They had surplus time and resources to invest in art, in cultural expression, in activities that didn't directly contribute to survival. That's the definition of civilization beginning. When a society produces more than it needs just to stay alive, it can start developing culture, technology, specialized knowledge. The geography of their world was remarkable in another way. The ancient lake was completely enclosed by land. To the south, a narrow land bridge separated it from the Sea of Marmara and ultimately the Mediterranean. This wasn't a massive mountain range. Geological surveys show it was probably only 300 to 400 feet higher than the lake surface, a strip of rocky, hilly terrain maybe 100 miles wide at its narrowest point. On one side, the freshwater lake. On the other side, the Sea of Marmara, connected to the Mediterranean, rising as global sea levels climbed steadily upward as the great ice sheets melted. The people living on the lake shores had no idea this barrier existed in any meaningful way. Why would they? It had been there for thousands of years. It seemed permanent, eternal, as fixed as the mountains in the distance. But it wasn't. The Ice Age was ending, and that changed everything. For about 10,000 years after the glaciers began retreating, global sea levels rose steadily. Not quickly enough to notice in a human lifetime, but inexorably. Inches per decade. feet per century. The Mediterranean rose, the Sea of Marmara rose, and the ancient lake just sat there, trapped behind its land barrier, 500 feet below. The people living on those shores had no frame of reference for what was coming. They might have noticed the lake level fluctuating with rainfall patterns. Wetter years would raise it slightly, droughts would lower it. But these were small variations, maybe a few feet at most. Nothing that threatened their communities, nothing that suggested catastrophe. Daily life followed seasonal rhythms. Spring would bring planting season, farmers preparing fields, selecting seeds from the previous year's harvest, carefully planting in patterns that maximized yield. Summer meant tending crops, fishing in the lake, hunting in the forests. Autumn brought harvest, the critical time when all the year's agricultural work paid off. Storage pits filled with grain, animals slaughtered and meat preserved for winter. Winter was the quiet time, a chance to repair tools, make pottery, work on crafts. This was probably when social bonds strengthened. Communities gathering in longhouses, sharing food, telling stories. Maybe this was when they developed the myths and legends that would eventually be passed down through generations, transformed and adapted, becoming the flood narratives we still recognize today. Children grew up learning the skills they'd need to survive. Boys probably learned hunting, fishing, tool making from their fathers and uncles. Girls learned agriculture, pottery, textile production from their mothers and aunts. But this wasn't rigid. In small communities, everyone needed multiple skills. A bad hunting season meant more reliance on fishing and farming. A crop failure meant more intensive hunting. They probably traded with other communities too. Archaeological evidence shows objects that came from hundreds of miles away. Obsidian from Anatolia, amber from the north, seashells from the Mediterranean, brought overland across that land bridge. This means communication networks, relationships between distant groups, possibly elaborate gift exchange systems that maintained peace and allowed resource sharing. Their technology was impressive by Neolithic standards. They had moved far beyond simple chipped stone tools. They were grinding and polishing stone axes, creating tools that could fell trees efficiently. They were making sophisticated ceramic vessels using coil building techniques. They were probably weaving textiles from plant fibers or animal wool. They had fire completely mastered, using it for cooking, heating, pottery firing, land clearing. Some communities were probably starting to work copper. The Neolithic was giving way to the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age. Simple copper objects, ornaments, maybe basic tools, appear in the archaeological record from regions around the ancient Black Sea. This represents another technological leap, understanding that certain rocks, when heated in specific ways, produce metal. That metal can be shaped. That shaped metal has properties different from stone or bone. They were on the verge of something. Another 1,000 years and their descendants might have developed bronze working, writing, the full package of early civilization. The region had everything necessary: agricultural surplus, trade networks, technological sophistication, growing populations, all the ingredients for the rise of complex societies. But they never got the chance, because while they lived their lives planting crops, raising children, building homes meant to last for generations, something was happening far to the south. The Mediterranean was rising, the Sea of Marmara was rising, and the land bridge holding back countless cubic miles of salt water was beginning to fail. Geological studies of the barrier region show it was probably limestone and sedimentary rock, strong enough under normal conditions but vulnerable to erosion. As sea levels rose on the Mediterranean side, water began finding weaknesses, tiny cracks, underground channels. Every year, a little more water seeped through. Every decade, the erosion accelerated slightly. The people on the lake shores noticed nothing. Maybe water levels in the lake rose slightly during wet periods, but nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested their entire world was about to be destroyed. They kept farming, kept fishing, kept building their homes and raising their families. They had no idea they were living on borrowed time. No way to know that within a few years, maybe a few decades, the land bridge would fail catastrophically and their paradise would become a drowning basin. No way to understand that they were creating the archaeological evidence that would, 10,000 years later, help us understand what happened when the ancient world drowned. They were just living, doing what humans do, building communities, raising children, trying to create something lasting in a world they thought was stable and predictable, a world that was about to prove them devastatingly wrong. Picture a ridge of land stretching across what is now the Bosphorus Strait. It's 5,600 BCE, give or take a century. For thousands of years, this natural dam has held back the Mediterranean Sea, protecting a vast freshwater lake to the north. The lake, what we now call the Black Sea, sits about 500 feet lower than the ocean beyond the ridge, maybe more. Nobody's standing there with surveying equipment, but the geological record is clear. There's a massive difference in elevation, and it's been stable for a very long time. Then something changes. It could have started with earthquakes. The region is tectonically active, always has been. Stress builds up along fault lines as continental plates grind against each other. Maybe there was a major quake, or a series of them, weakening the rock and soil that form the barrier. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Maybe thousands of years of erosion finally wore the barrier thin enough that water started seeping through. A trickle at first, barely noticeable, then more. The Mediterranean was higher, so it wanted to flow downhill. Basic physics. But once it started, there was no stopping it. The first breach was probably small, maybe just a stream, something you could jump across. But water is patient and relentless. It carves, it erodes, it finds every weakness. That stream would have begun cutting into the land barrier, carrying away soil and rock, widening the channel hour by hour. As the channel grew, more water could flow through. As more water flowed, the erosion accelerated. Positive feedback loop, the kind that ends in catastrophe. Within days, maybe hours, that small stream became a torrent, then a cascade, then something that has no comparison in human experience except maybe the worst imaginable nightmare. The geological evidence suggests the water was flowing through at a rate equivalent to 200 Niagara Falls. Let that sink in for a moment. Not one Niagara Falls, 200, all pouring through a channel that was being carved wider and deeper with every passing hour. The noise alone would have been apocalyptic, a constant thunder that you could hear for hundreds of miles. The ground would have shaken. The air would have been filled with mist and spray, creating permanent rainbows over the catastrophe. And this wasn't over in a day or a week. This went on for months, maybe years. Some estimates suggest the Mediterranean poured into the Black Sea basin for 2 years straight before the water levels finally equalized. Now think about what's happening to the freshwater lake during this time. It's rising, fast. The most conservative estimates suggest the water level was going up about 6 inches per day. That might not sound like much, 6 inches. You can measure that with a ruler, but spread that across thousands of square miles of coastline, and you're talking about entire landscapes disappearing while people sleep. Villages that were half a mile from the water in the morning would be underwater by evening. Fertile valleys where families had farmed for generations would vanish in a week, 6 inches per day, every single day, for months or years. There was no high ground to retreat to, not really. The northern shore of the Black Sea is basically a plain that extends for hundreds of miles inland. When the water started rising, there was nowhere to go except away. Just keep moving, keep fleeing, always staying ahead of the advancing sea. And it wasn't just the water itself. As the sea level rose, it would have pushed up through river valleys and deltas, working its way inland along every watercourse. Communities that thought they were safe because they weren't directly on the coast would have found salt water flowing up their rivers, poisoning their drinking water, killing their crops. The flooding would have been coming from multiple directions at once. The archaeological evidence tells us this happened incredibly fast in geological terms. Core samples taken from the Black Sea floor show a distinctive transition layer. Below it, freshwater sediments filled with pollen from lakeside plants and shells from freshwater mollusks. Above it, saltwater sediments with marine organisms, and the transition between these two layers is sharp, not gradual, not a slow mixing over centuries. Sharp, like someone flipped a switch. This is the signature of catastrophic change. Researchers have mapped ancient river valleys on the Black Sea floor, channels that were carved when the basin was a lake, and the rivers flowed into it at a much lower elevation. These valleys end abruptly at what was once the coastline, then continue as underwater canyons cutting across the continental shelf. The preservation is remarkable. After 7,600 years underwater, you can still see the topography of the drowned landscape. The contours of hills, the courses of streams, the places where the land gently sloped down to the ancient lakeshore. And everywhere across this submerged landscape there are signs of human habitation. Stone tools, pottery fragments, the remains of structures, all of it buried under hundreds of feet of water and covered by thousands of years of marine sediment. But it's down there, frozen in time, waiting. Now, there's debate among scientists about exactly how fast this catastrophe unfolded. Some researchers argue the flooding was even more rapid than the 6-inch per day estimate. They point to the sheer volume of water involved and the evidence of massive erosion at the Bosphorus. They suggest the sea level might have risen several feet per day during the peak of the flooding. Others think it was more gradual, taking decades or even centuries for the Black Sea to fill completely. But here's the thing. Even if it took centuries, that's still catastrophically fast for the people living through it. A human lifetime is maybe 70 years if you're lucky, probably less in the Neolithic. If the sea level rose 500 feet over 2 centuries, that means it went up 2.5 feet every year. That's still villages disappearing, coastlines retreating miles inland, entire regions becoming uninhabitable within a single generation. The younger generation would have grown up hearing their grandparents talk about lands that were now beneath the waves. They would have seen coastal settlements abandoned one after another as the water kept rising. They would have lived their entire lives in a world that was actively drowning, where the one constant was that the sea always won and you always had to keep moving inland. The biological evidence backs up the catastrophic scenario. When researchers analyse core samples from the Black Sea floor, they can see the mass die-off of freshwater species happening in that same narrow transition layer. Freshwater mollusks, algae, plants, they all disappear suddenly, and just as suddenly they're replaced by saltwater species, but not local species that gradually adapted. These are Mediterranean organisms, invaders that came pouring in with the flood, colonising a new sea that had been carved out of an ancient lake. The chemical signature is just as dramatic. Freshwater and saltwater have different ratios of oxygen isotopes. When you analyse the shells of organisms that lived through the transition, you can see the change happening in their own bodies. Freshwater organisms show freshwater isotope signatures. Then suddenly those signatures shift towards saltwater values, then the organisms die. They didn't have time to adapt. The change was too fast, too extreme, but the most haunting evidence comes from the Black Sea's deep waters. Below about 150 metres, the Black Sea is anoxic. No oxygen, no life, nothing but hydrogen sulfide and darkness. This condition was created by the flood. When all that salt water poured in, it was denser than the fresh water already in the basin. It sank to the bottom and stayed there, creating a permanent stratification. The deep fresh water, now trapped beneath a layer of salt water, couldn't mix with the surface anymore. It couldn't be replenished with oxygen. Over time, it became a dead zone, a toxic layer that has persisted for 7,600 years. And this anoxic layer has preserved everything that sank into it. Shipwrecks that would have rotted away centuries ago in normal seawater are still intact down there, their wood preserved, their ropes still coiled, their cargoes still in place. When archaeologists finally developed the technology to explore these depths, they found vessels from ancient Greece, from Rome, from Byzantine times, all sitting on the bottom in near-perfect condition. Museums of maritime history preserved by the catastrophe that created them. But the ships came later. We'll get to those. Right now we're still at the moment of the flood, still watching that wall of water carve through the Bosphorus and pour into the basin beyond. Think about the choice facing the people who lived on those ancient shores. You're a farmer, let's say. Your family has worked this land for generations. Your great-great-grandparents are buried in the hills overlooking your fields. You know every stone, every tree, every bend in the river. This is your world, the only world you've ever known. Then one day, someone comes running from the south. They're talking about something impossible. The water, they say, the lake, it's rising. Villages are flooding. People are fleeing north. You don't believe it at first. The lake has always been there, stable, reliable. But then you go look for yourself, and you see the water is indeed higher than it was last month, higher than it was last year. The beach where you used to gather shellfish is gone. The reed beds where you set fish traps are submerged. Maybe you decide to move your family to higher ground. Just temporarily, you tell yourself. Just until things settle down. You pack up what you can carry, drive your livestock inland, and settle on a ridge that's safely above the current water level. You can still see your old home from here. You tell yourself you'll go back once the water recedes, but it doesn't recede. It keeps rising. A month later, your old home is underwater. The fields where you grew wheat are now part of the lake. You can still see your roof beams poking above the surface, but the water is rising over them even as you watch. You move further inland, then further still. Then you realize this isn't going to stop. The water is going to keep coming, and everything you knew is going to end up on the bottom of this ever-expanding sea. So you grab what you can carry and you walk away. You walk north, away from the rising water. Maybe you walk west or east, following the retreating coastline. But you walk, and you keep walking, because the alternative is to stay and drown. Thousands of people made this choice. Maybe tens of thousands. We don't know the population density of the Black Sea coast in 5,600 BCE, but it was probably substantial. The region had rich soils, abundant fresh water, and plenty of fish and game. It would have been prime real estate for Neolithic farmers and fishers. All those people had to go somewhere when the flood came. Some probably died. The elderly, the sick, the ones who couldn't or wouldn't leave. Maybe some people tried to stay, tried to adapt by moving their settlements inland again and again until finally there was nowhere left to go. Maybe some communities managed to load their possessions onto boats and float to safety. But most people probably just walked, refugees from a drowning world, carrying whatever they could, heading anywhere that wasn't underwater. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because when you have thousands of people suddenly displaced by catastrophe, they don't just vanish. They go somewhere. They settle in new regions. They tell their stories to their children and grandchildren. They turn their trauma into myth, into legend, into the foundational narratives that shape cultures for thousands of years. There are flood stories scattered across the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia describes a flood that covered the earth, sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The biblical story of Noah tells almost the same tale. The Greeks had Deucalion, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. The Hindus have Manu. Nearly every ancient culture around the Mediterranean and Near East has some version of the same story. A great flood, divine anger, a few survivors who rebuild civilization afterward. For a long time, scholars thought these were just myths, universal stories that humans tell to explain natural disasters, to make sense of the frightening power of nature. But what if they weren't just myths? What if they were memories? The Black Sea flood happened at exactly the right time to have influenced these stories. 5600 BCE is right at the dawn of civilization in the Near East. Within a few centuries of the flood, we start seeing the development of complex societies in Mesopotamia. Writing, cities, organized religion, all emerging in a relatively short period, and all carrying stories of a great flood that destroyed the world before. Could refugees from the Black Sea flood have carried their stories south into Mesopotamia? Could the trauma of watching your entire world drown have been so profound that it echoed through thousands of years of oral tradition, before finally being written down in texts like Gilgamesh? The timing works, the geography works, the details, the specifics about the water rising and covering the land, about people fleeing in boats, about the old world being destroyed and a new world beginning afterward, all of it matches what we know about the Black Sea event. But there's a problem, a significant one. Not all scientists agree the flood was catastrophic enough to generate these myths. Some argue the sea level rise was gradual, that people had plenty of time to adapt and relocate. They point out that even 6 inches per day, while significant, isn't the kind of sudden, overwhelming deluge described in the flood myths. Those stories talk about water covering the earth in days, not years, and they might be right. Maybe the Black Sea flood was dramatic in geological terms, but not apocalyptic in human terms. Maybe the flood myths come from somewhere else entirely, from some other catastrophe we haven't identified yet. Or maybe they're just stories, universal human attempts to explain the power of water and weather. But then again, maybe catastrophe is relative. If you're a Neolithic farmer watching your ancestral land slowly but inexorably disappear beneath rising water, watching your community fragment as families flee in different directions, watching everything you knew and loved vanish beneath the waves, does it matter if it took months or years instead of days? The world still ended, your world anyway, and that's the kind of trauma that gets remembered, that gets passed down, that becomes myth. The Black Sea remembers, the sediments remember, the drowned valleys remember, and somewhere in the darkness, hundreds of feet below the surface, the remains of those ancient communities are still waiting to tell us what really happened, waiting to confirm or refute the theories, waiting to show us what it was like when the Mediterranean broke through and the world drowned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what's down there, we need to talk about how we found it in the first place. How modern scientists, using technology that would seem like magic to those Neolithic refugees, finally located the evidence of the catastrophe. How they mapped the drowned coastlines and discovered the preserved settlements. How they confirmed that yes, something extraordinary happened here. Something that changed the course of human history. That story begins decades ago, with curious researchers, sophisticated equipment, and a sea full of secrets. For thousands of years, nobody knew. The Black Sea kept its secrets buried under hundreds of feet of dark, lifeless water. Fishermen pulled their nets through the surface layers. Ships crossed the sea on ancient trade routes. Coastal cities rose and fell along its modern shores. And all the while, just a few 100 meters down, An entire lost world waited in perfect preservation, frozen in time, hidden in darkness, waiting for someone to develop the technology to find it. That someone was Robert Ballard. You probably know him as the guy who found the Titanic in 1985, but in 1999, Ballard turned his attention to something potentially more significant. Not a sunken ship, but an entire drowned civilization. He'd read the theories about the Black Sea catastrophe, the idea that 7,600 years ago a massive flood had transformed the sea from a freshwater lake into a saltwater abyss. Most underwater archaeologists thought searching for evidence was pointless. The Black Sea was too deep, too dark, too difficult to explore. Any settlements that might have existed would have been destroyed by currents, buried under sediment, or eroded away by centuries of saltwater exposure. Ballard disagreed. He knew something most archaeologists didn't, something that would change everything. The Black Sea was unlike any other body of water on Earth. Below about 150 meters depth, there is no oxygen. None. Zero. The water is completely anoxic, saturated with hydrogen sulfide from bacterial decomposition. Nothing can live down there. No fish, no crabs, no boring mollusks that eat through wooden ships. Most importantly, no bacteria capable of decomposing organic materials. This meant anything that sank below that 150-meter threshold would be preserved. Not just preserved like objects in other shipwrecks, slowly deteriorating over centuries, perfectly preserved. Wood that should have rotted away, thousands of years ago still intact. Rope and fabric undisturbed. Tools lying exactly where they were dropped. If there were ancient settlements down there, they wouldn't just be ruins. They would be time capsules, frozen moments from the moment the flood hit. Ballard assembled an expedition team and headed to the Turkish coast in September 1999. They brought advanced deep-sea sonar mapping equipment, robotic submersibles equipped with cameras and sampling arms, and most crucially, technology developed for deep-sea oil exploration that could create three-dimensional maps of the seafloor. They didn't just want to find random artifacts. They wanted to map the entire drowned landscape to see what the world looked like before the flood. The first thing they discovered was the ancient coastline itself. Running the sonar back and forth across a grid pattern, they watched as the computer slowly assembled an image of what lay beneath. And there it was, a clear geological boundary about 150 meters down, marking the transition between the old freshwater lake and the modern saltwater sea. This was the shoreline where people had lived 7,600 years ago, the edge of the world before the Mediterranean broke through. But that was just the beginning. As they continued mapping, following the ancient coastline, they found something that made everyone on the research vessel stop and stare at the monitors. A river valley. Not just any river valley, but an enormous ancient river system that had once drained into the freshwater lake. You could see everything. The main channel winding across what was now the seafloor, tributary streams branching off, even the natural terraces where sediment had built up over thousands of years before the flood. This is where people would have lived. River valleys meant fresh water, fertile soil, fish, transportation routes. Every major early civilization emerged along rivers for exactly these reasons. If there were settlements, they would be here, clustered along these ancient waterways that now lay hundreds of feet underwater in total darkness. Ballard's team deployed their submersibles. Imagine piloting a remote-controlled vehicle through absolute blackness, your only view coming from lights mounted on the sub, illuminating just a few meters of seafloor at a time. They followed the ancient river channel, cameras recording every detail. Hours of nothing but sediment, the occasional modern shipwreck, fish swimming through their lights. Then, on September 13, 1999, They saw it. A structure. Man-made, unmistakable. Carefully cut beams arranged at right angles. Notches carved to fit other pieces of wood that had long since shifted position. It was a building, or what remained of one, collapsed but preserved. The wood was still solid, not petrified, not decomposed, just old. 7,600 years old, resting on the seafloor exactly where it had stood when the flood came. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Wood doesn't survive that long underwater. Except here, in the anoxic depths of the Black Sea, it did. The submersible's robotic arms carefully collected samples. Carbon dating would later confirm what Ballard already suspected. This structure dated to approximately 5,500 BCE, right around the time the flood would have occurred. But one structure could be a fluke, an outlier. They needed more evidence. Over the following weeks, Ballard's team discovered multiple sites along the ancient coastline, worked stone that clearly showed human tool marks, ceramic fragments that had once been pottery, storage vessels, cooking implements. Most remarkably, they found these artifacts in context, meaning they were still in meaningful arrangements, not scattered randomly by currents, but lying where they had been used, where people had dropped them when they fled the rising waters. At one site, the submersible found what appeared to be a stone tool manufacturing area. Flint cores and stone flakes arranged in a pattern that suggested systematic tool production. Someone had been sitting here, methodically creating stone implements, probably for trade or daily use. Then the water came, and they abandoned everything. The site had remained undisturbed for 76 centuries. The technology that made these discoveries possible represents a revolution in underwater archaeology. Traditional diving is impossible at these depths. Humans can't survive the pressure, the darkness, the toxic hydrogen sulfide. Even modern submarines struggle with the conditions. Everything has to be done with remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, guided by technicians watching video feeds from the surface. The ROVs used in Black Sea exploration are marvels of engineering. They're equipped with high-definition cameras that can see in near-total darkness, sonar systems that map the seafloor in 3 dimensions, and robotic arms precise enough to collect tiny artifacts without disturbing the surrounding context. They can stay down for days at a time, powered and controlled through cables connecting them to the surface ship. But even with this technology, the work is incredibly challenging. You're working blind, essentially. The ROV pilots are looking at screens, trying to interpret what they're seeing through murky water in artificial light. Distance and size are difficult to judge. Objects that look small might be huge, or vice versa. And you're doing all this while the research vessel fights currents and waves on the surface, causing the ROV to drift and sway unpredictably. The pressure at these depths is crushing, literally. At 150 meters, the pressure is about 16 times atmospheric pressure at sea level. Equipment failures are common. Lights burn out, cameras flood, robotic arms jam. Every dive is expensive, time-consuming and risky. You might spend days preparing for a single ROV deployment, then have a critical system fail minutes after reaching the seafloor. But the potential rewards make it worthwhile. Since Ballard's initial discoveries, other expeditions have continued the work. In 2003, a team from the University of Pennsylvania conducted extensive sonar mapping, creating detailed 3-dimensional models of the drowned landscape. They identified dozens of potential archaeological sites, places where geological features and sonar readings suggested human settlement. In 2007, researchers from Bulgaria and the United States discovered what appeared to be the remains of a dock or pier, wooden pilings driven into the ancient lake bed. This suggested the pre-flood inhabitants weren't just fishermen with simple canoes. They had developed maritime infrastructure, permanent installations for boat building and maintenance. More recent expeditions have employed even more advanced technology. Side-scan sonar can now create images so detailed you can identify individual architectural features from the surface. Multi-beam sonar arrays map entire square kilometers of seafloor in a single pass, and new generations of ROVs can collect samples, take measurements, and create photogrammetric reconstructions of sites, all without human divers ever entering the water. The most exciting developments involve artificial intelligence and machine learning. Researchers are training computer systems to analyze sonar data and automatically identify potential archaeological features. The Black Sea floor is enormous, covering over 436,000 square kilometers. Searching it all manually would take centuries, but AI can scan the data in days, flagging anomalies and structures that deserve closer investigation. Every expedition brings new discoveries. In 2016, researchers found what appeared to be a complete preserved fishing net. The fibre still intact after 7,600 years. In 2018, they discovered ceramic vessels that still contained residues, opening up possibilities for analysing ancient diet and agriculture. In 2021, they located what might be the remains of a larger settlement, multiple structures clustered together along an ancient stream bed. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. We're not just finding random artifacts anymore. We're mapping an entire lost landscape, reconstructing what life was like before the flood. The ancient river valleys, the settlements along their banks, the boats and docks and tools and homes of a people who had no idea they were living on borrowed time. The Black Sea's unique conditions mean we're finding things that would never survive anywhere else. Wooden artifacts that would have rotted away in other seas are here in near-perfect condition. Organic materials that normally decompose within decades have lasted millennia. We're seeing details of ancient life that archaeologists excavating land sites could only dream of, but we've only scratched the surface. Most of the ancient coastline remains unexplored. Hundreds, maybe thousands of sites are still waiting to be discovered. With each passing year, technology improves, making it cheaper and easier to explore these extreme depths. What once required a major expedition with a dedicated research vessel can now be done with smaller teams and portable equipment. The question is no longer whether there's a lost world down there. We know there is. The question is how much survived, how well preserved it is, and what it can teach us about the people who lived through one of the most catastrophic events in human history. The answer is slowly emerging from the darkness. One sonar scan, one ROV dive, one preserved artifact at a time. Picture this. You're in a submersible, descending through the cold darkness of the Black Sea. The sunlight fades quickly, turning from blue to indigo to black. Your lights cut through water that's been undisturbed for thousands of years. The descent continues. 50 meters, 100 meters, 150 meters, and then, suddenly, impossibly, walls appear in your viewport. Not natural rock formations. Walls, built by human hands, standing exactly where they were placed 7,600 years ago, when the Mediterranean came crashing through the Bosphorus and drowned an entire civilization in a matter of months. This isn't science fiction. This is what archaeologists have actually found beneath the Black Sea, and what they're discovering is rewriting everything we thought we knew about Neolithic societies, underwater preservation, and the lost world that existed before the flood. The first confirmed settlements were discovered off the coast of Bulgaria, near the town of Sozopol. Not just scattered artifacts or isolated structures, but actual settlement complexes. Foundations laid out in organized patterns, stone walls still standing at angles that match architectural traditions from surrounding land sites, post holes where wooden supports once held up roofs and walls, and most remarkably, all of it preserved in conditions that are completely unique in the world of underwater archaeology. The Bulgarian sites sit at depths between 80 and 120 metres. That might not sound dramatic compared to deep ocean trenches, but it places them in what Black Sea researchers call the death zone. Below about 150 metres, the Black Sea contains no oxygen. None. The deepest parts of this sea are filled with hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas that kills everything except specialised bacteria. But between 100 and 200 metres, you hit this strange transition layer where oxygen disappears, but the water isn't quite toxic enough to dissolve everything immediately. It's in this narrow band that the drowned settlements have survived, frozen in time like biological time capsules. What makes these sites so extraordinary isn't just that they exist, it's what's still there. On land, archaeological sites from 7,600 years ago typically preserve only the most durable materials. Stone foundations, ceramic fragments, maybe some charred wood if conditions are right. Organic materials, fabric, rope, leather, wood, they decay within decades or centuries at most. But in the anoxic waters of the Black Sea, the normal rules of decomposition don't apply. Without oxygen, the bacteria and organisms that break down organic matter can't survive. So things just sit there, unchanged, waiting. The first time researchers brought up samples from these sites, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Wooden beams with tool marks still visible, rope made from twisted plant fibres that were still flexible after 7,600 years underwater, leather fragments that still showed stitching patterns, baskets woven from reeds that maintained their original shape. It was like opening a tomb that had been sealed the day the flood arrived, because in a very real sense that's exactly what it was. The most extensively studied site lies off the Bulgarian coast near Cape Shabla. Surveys using side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles have mapped an area covering roughly 3 square kilometres. The settlement wasn't built all at once. The architectural evidence shows at least 3 distinct construction phases, suggesting the community lived here for multiple generations before the flood arrived. The earlier structures are simple, rectangular foundations measuring roughly 4 by 6 metres, the size of a modest single-room dwelling. Post holes at regular intervals indicate they used vertical wooden posts to support walls and roofs, probably filling the spaces between posts with wattle and daub, woven branches covered with mud and clay. But the later structures are different, larger, more complex. Some foundations show multiple rooms with internal divisions. Others have what appear to be communal spaces, open areas surrounded by structures on 3 sides. This isn't random building. This is settlement planning, evidence of a community making decisions about how to organise shared space. The walls themselves tell stories. They're made from local stone, probably gathered from the coastline that once existed just metres from these structures. But the stones aren't just piled haphazardly. They're selected for size and shape, then fitted together with remarkable precision. Some walls still stand 3 or 4 courses high. Whoever built these settlements understood weight distribution and structural stability. They weren't primitive. They were skilled builders creating permanent homes. The artifacts recovered from these sites are rewriting our understanding of Neolithic Black Sea cultures. Pottery fragments show sophisticated firing techniques and decorative patterns that match styles found at land sites in Bulgaria and Romania. But some vessels are unique, designs that don't appear anywhere else, suggesting these coastal communities were developing their own cultural identity. Stone tools recovered from the underwater sites include specialised implements for working wood, processing fish, and crafting leather. The tool assemblages are diverse, indicating these weren't single-purpose settlements. People were engaging in multiple activities, the full range of daily life, cooking, crafting, maintaining tools, processing food. But it's the organic artifacts that are truly revolutionary. At a land site, you might find a few preserved seeds or charred grain if you're extremely lucky. At these Black Sea sites, researchers have recovered complete samples of food storage materials, nuts still in their shells, seeds showing bite marks from rodents, fish bones with cut marks from stone knives, evidence of specific butchering techniques. These materials let us reconstruct diet and subsistence patterns with precision that's usually impossible for Neolithic sites. One particularly remarkable find was a fishing net, or rather, fragments of a fishing net preserved well enough to reconstruct the knotting technique and measure the mesh size. This tells us exactly what size fish they were targeting and how they were doing it. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding an ancient technology manual. The net's construction matches techniques still used by traditional fishers in some parts of the Mediterranean, suggesting these methods persisted for thousands of years because they worked. Other sites have been identified off the Romanian coast near the Danube Delta. These settlements show different architectural patterns than the Bulgarian sites. Instead of rectangular structures arranged in loose clusters, the Romanian sites have more linear arrangements, buildings positioned along what were probably the banks of ancient river channels. This makes sense. Before the flood, the Danube would have emptied into the Black Sea lake system through a series of distributary channels. Communities living along these channels would have access to both fresh water and the resources of the lake. They could fish, hunt waterfowl in the marshes, and trade with communities further up the river system. The preservation at these sites varies depending on exact depth and local conditions. Some areas show spectacular preservation with wooden artifacts and organic materials intact. Others have been more disturbed, possibly by ancient currents or more recent fishing activities. But even the disturbed sites provide valuable data. The distribution of artifacts across the seafloor can tell us about settlement organization. Concentrations of pottery in certain areas suggest dedicated cooking or food storage locations. Stone tool distributions reveal activity areas, places where people sat to make and repair their implements. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. The sites discovered so far, the ones that have been mapped and studied, they're almost certainly just the beginning. Think about the geography. The Black Sea has over 4,000 kilometers of coastline. Before the flood, the lake that occupied this basin had even more coastline because the water level was lower. We're talking about tens of thousands of kilometers of prime coastal real estate. Freshwater access, abundant fish and waterfowl, fertile soil from river sediments, protection from extreme weather, everything you'd want for a Neolithic settlement. The sites discovered so far were found almost by accident. Surveys conducted for oil and gas exploration. Sonar scans done for navigation safety. Targeted searches in areas where land sites suggested nearby coastal settlements might have existed. Nobody has conducted a systematic archaeological survey of the entire Black Sea basin. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take decades. But every time researchers look in areas where settlements should theoretically exist, they find evidence of human occupation. Stone tools on the seafloor, pottery fragments, worked wood, and sometimes, if they're very lucky, intact structures. Statistical modelling based on the density of known sites suggests there could be hundreds, possibly thousands of drowned settlements around the Black Sea. Most will be small, hamlets of a few dozen people living in a handful of structures, but some, particularly near major river mouths where resources would have been most abundant, could be much larger. We're talking about communities of hundreds or possibly thousands of people, villages that would qualify as significant population centres for the Neolithic period. Entire towns preserved beneath the waves, waiting to be discovered. The technology exists to find them. High-resolution multibeam sonar can create detailed maps of the seafloor showing individual structures. Autonomous underwater vehicles can cover vast areas, photographing the bottom in high definition and building 3D models of sites. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with manipulator arms can collect samples without risking human divers at dangerous depths. But the technology is expensive. Most Black Sea nations have limited archaeological budgets, and underwater work is always risky and logistically complex. So the vast majority of the drowned world remains unexplored and unmapped. What we have discovered is already changing archaeology. The Black Sea sites provide something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world: perfectly preserved Neolithic settlements complete with organic materials. Other underwater archaeological sites exist, obviously. The Mediterranean is full of ancient shipwrecks and submerged Roman ports, but most underwater sites either date from historical periods with written records, or they've been underwater so long that only the most durable materials survive. The Black Sea sites are different. They're old enough to represent a period we know very little about, the Neolithic transition, when humans first started building permanent settlements. But they're young enough that the flood which drowned them is within the range of historical memory, possibly even the origin of flood myths that appear in multiple ancient cultures. And the preservation is simply unmatched. Researchers comparing Black Sea artifacts to similar materials from other underwater sites describe the difference as shocking. A wooden artifact from a Mediterranean wreck might show the basic shape and some surface details. The same artifact from the Black Sea looks like it was submerged yesterday. Tool marks are crisp, wood grain patterns are visible, even paint or dye residues sometimes survive. It's preservation quality that approaches what you'd find in permanently frozen archaeological sites in the Arctic, except these sites are accessible year-round and don't require specialized cold weather equipment. What this means is that we're learning things about Neolithic life that would be impossible to discover any other way. The layout of settlements tells us about social organization. Were houses all roughly the same size, suggesting an egalitarian society? Or are some structures significantly larger and better built, indicating social hierarchy? The Black Sea sites show both patterns. Some settlements appear egalitarian with similar-sized structures arranged informally. Others show clear evidence of central planning and differentiation between structures. This suggests we're looking at a complex, regionally diverse culture, not a single homogeneous Neolithic society. The artifacts tell us about trade networks. Obsidian blades found at coastal sites came from sources in Anatolia, hundreds of kilometers away. Certain pottery styles show influences from multiple regional traditions. These weren't isolated communities. They were part of extensive trade and communication networks linking populations across the entire Black Sea basin. When the flood came, it didn't just destroy individual settlements. It severed trade routes, disrupted kinship networks, and fractured what had been an integrated regional culture. The survivors scattered, carrying with them memories of the world that drowned. Memories that would eventually transform into the flood myths we still tell today. But for now, most of that drowned world remains hidden. Somewhere beneath the dark waters, larger settlements wait to be discovered. Maybe complete village complexes with dozens of structures. Maybe even fortified sites with defensive walls. If Neolithic Black Sea societies had developed the social complexity to engage in organized warfare, maybe ceremonial centers or burial grounds that could tell us about their religious beliefs and social rituals. The technology to find these sites exists. The historical importance is beyond question. All that's missing is the funding, political will, and international cooperation necessary to mount systematic exploration of one of the world's largest and least explored archaeological landscapes. Until then, researchers work with what they can access, mapping sites near shore, collecting artifacts when funding allows, building 3D models and creating databases, waiting for the day when we finally have the resources to truly explore the drowned world and discover what other secrets lie preserved in the Black Sea's anoxic depths. Here's what we know for certain. When the Mediterranean came crashing through the Bosphorus around 5600 BCE, it didn't flood an empty wilderness. It drowned a civilization. Not in the modern sense, with cities and writing and organized government, but a thriving, sophisticated culture of people who had already figured out something that would change human history forever. They had learned to farm. The archaeological evidence comes from what the water couldn't destroy. Sites just beyond the flood zone, settlements that survived on higher ground, showing us exactly what kind of world existed before the deluge. And what that evidence reveals is remarkable. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers barely scraping by. These were agriculturalists, animal herders, pottery makers, people who had made the transition that archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to producing food, from following wild animals to keeping domestic ones, from temporary camps to permanent villages. But they weren't doing it the way you might expect. See, when we think about the birth of agriculture, we usually think about Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, those famous sites in modern Iraq and Syria, where farming first emerged around 10,000 BCE. And that's accurate, that's where it started. But by the time the Black Sea flooded, farming had been spreading for 4,000 years, moving north and west, adapting to new climates and new environments. The people living around that freshwater lake were part of this agricultural revolution's second wave. They had taken technologies developed in the Near East and modified them for the cooler, wetter conditions of the Black Sea basin. The evidence shows up in multiple ways. First, there's the pottery, settlements around the perimeter of the ancient lake, sites that are now dozens of miles inland from the modern coast, have yielded thousands of pottery fragments. Not crude experimental ceramics, but sophisticated vessels with standardized forms and decorative patterns. Storage jars for grain, cooking pots designed for specific purposes, serving dishes that suggest formal meals and social gatherings. This is the signature of settled life. You don't make heavy pottery if you're constantly moving. You make it when you have a permanent home and need to store the surplus from your fields. Then there's the animal bones. Archaeological excavations show a dramatic shift in the species present at these sites. Wild game becomes less common. Domestic animals, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, start dominating the assemblages, and not just any animals. The bones show the telltale signs of selective breeding, animals that had been managed by humans for generations, smaller, more docile, with different proportions than their wild ancestors. These people weren't just hunting whatever they could find. They were maintaining herds, protecting them from predators, probably moving them between pastures seasonally. They had become pastoralists. Most importantly, there are the plant remains. Carbonized seeds recovered from hearths and storage pits tell the real story. Cultivated wheat and barley varieties that don't exist in the wild. Lentils and peas that had been selected for larger size and easier harvesting. Flax for making linen. These weren't wild plants that people had gathered. These were crops, domesticated species that required planting, tending and harvesting. Agriculture, genuine food production, had arrived at the Black Sea. But here's where it gets really interesting. These people weren't just copying what farmers in Mesopotamia were doing. They were innovating, adapting, creating their own agricultural systems suited to their specific environment. The Black Sea basin before the flood was cooler and wetter than the Near East. Different soils, different rainfall patterns, different growing seasons. The crops and techniques that worked in Syria or Turkey had to be modified, and the archaeological evidence shows they were remarkably successful at it. Sites around the ancient lake show evidence of sophisticated water management, irrigation channels, drainage ditches, probably systems for capturing and storing rainfall. They had figured out how to make agriculture work in an environment that wasn't naturally suited to the crops they were growing. This takes experimentation, innovation, generational accumulation of knowledge. You don't just move to a new region and start farming. You have to learn, adapt, probably fail multiple times before you succeed. So who exactly were these people? Where did they come from originally? And here we enter much more speculative territory. Because unlike their tools and pottery and animal bones, the people themselves didn't leave direct evidence. No written records, obviously. No monumental architecture that could definitively link them to known cultures. Just the material traces of their daily lives and some tantalizing clues from linguistics and genetics. The linguistic evidence is particularly intriguing. Some researchers have suggested that the Black Sea region, before the flood, might have been a homeland for the early Indo-European languages. Now this is controversial. The Indo-European question, where these languages came from and how they spread, is one of the most hotly debated topics in archaeology and historical linguistics. But the Black Sea hypothesis has some compelling elements. Indo-European languages eventually came to dominate Europe, Iran, and much of South Asia. They include Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, and most modern European languages. Something caused these related languages to spread across an enormous area, carrying similar words for basic agricultural concepts, animals, and social structures. The question is what? Some researchers think it was a migration from the steppes north of the Black Sea around 4000 BCE, pastoralists moving out with horses and wheeled vehicles, but others wonder if there was an earlier dispersal, maybe triggered by some catastrophic event that forced people to leave their homeland and spread their language and culture to new territories, like, say, a massive flood that drowned their entire world. If the pre-flood Black Sea basin was indeed an Indo-European homeland, then the survivors fleeing the rising waters would have carried their language with them, some going north into the steppes, some west toward the Balkans and eventually Europe, some east toward Anatolia and Iran, each group adapting their ancestral language to new environments and new neighbours, gradually differentiating until they became the diverse Indo-European family we know today. It's a compelling scenario, but it's also speculative. Other researchers place the Indo-European homeland elsewhere or argue for different mechanisms of dispersal. The truth is, we don't know for certain who these people were or what language they spoke, but we do know they existed, and we know their world was destroyed. The genetic evidence adds another layer of complexity. Ancient DNA recovered from burials around the Black Sea region shows a population with mixed ancestry, connections both to early Near Eastern farmers and to indigenous hunter-gatherer populations from Eastern Europe. This matches what we'd expect. As agriculture spread north from its origins in Mesopotamia, farmers intermarried with local populations, creating new genetic and cultural combinations. The people around the Black Sea weren't a pure population transplanted from elsewhere. They were a blend, a synthesis of different ancestral groups who had come together in this fertile basin and created something new. But then their world ended, and those survivors, the ones who escaped the rising waters, they had to go somewhere. They had to rebuild. And this is where the flood might have changed history in ways we're only beginning to understand. Imagine you're one of those survivors. You've spent your entire life in a valley that offered everything: fertile soil, abundant water, good grazing for your animals, rivers full of fish. Then, over the course of weeks or months, it all disappears under salt water. Your fields are drowned. Your village is under water. Your ancestors' graves are lost beneath the waves. Everything you knew is gone. You flee, taking what you can carry: your surviving livestock, some seed grain, your tools, your family. You walk for days or weeks until you find new territory, but you're not alone. Thousands of others are fleeing too, all moving away from the expanding lake, all looking for new land. The surrounding regions, which had their own established populations, suddenly have to absorb a massive influx of refugees. Some are welcomed, intermarrying with local groups and sharing their agricultural knowledge. Others have to fight for territory. Some probably perished, unable to adapt or find suitable land. But those who survived carried something with them beyond just their possessions. They carried a story, the memory of the world that drowned, the tale of how the waters came and destroyed everything their ancestors had built. And this story, this cultural trauma, might have spread far beyond the Black Sea region, because a flood narrative shows up in dozens of ancient cultures across Europe and the Near East. Not just the biblical story, but Greek myths, Sumerian legends, ancient Indian texts, all describing catastrophic floods that wiped out the old world. Could these diverse flood stories all stem from a single actual event? Could refugees from the Black Sea have carried their flood tale to surrounding regions, where it was adopted, adapted, and eventually became part of the foundational myths of multiple civilizations? It's possible. Trauma shapes culture in profound ways. A disaster that destroyed an entire world would have left psychological scars across generations. The survivors would have told their children about what was lost. Those children would have told their children. The story would have spread, evolved, taken on mythological dimensions, but retained the core memory of catastrophic inundation. The archaeological evidence shows clear disruption in settlement patterns across southeastern Europe around the time of the flood. Sites are abandoned, new sites appear in different locations, pottery styles change, indicating either population movement or cultural transformation. Something happened that reshaped the human landscape of the region, and the most likely explanation is that thousands of people were forced to relocate when their homeland was destroyed by rising water. Those people brought their agricultural knowledge, their animal herding practices, their pottery traditions, and their stories to new territories. They intermarried with local populations, creating new genetic and cultural combinations. They adapted their farming techniques to new environments, spreading agricultural practices into regions that had been dominated by hunter-gatherers. In other words, the flood might have actually accelerated the spread of agriculture across Europe. By forcing sophisticated farmers to relocate and integrate with surrounding populations, it could have jump-started the Neolithic transition in regions that otherwise might have taken centuries longer to adopt food production. The disaster that destroyed one world helped create many new ones, but we'll probably never know the full story of these drowned peoples, their names, their specific beliefs, the details of their daily lives, all lost beneath the Black Sea. What we can know is that they existed, that they had created a thriving culture in a region that seemed like paradise, and that when catastrophe struck, some of them survived to tell the tale. And maybe, just maybe, that tale is still being told. Every time we hear a flood myth, every time we encounter stories of lost worlds and rising waters, we might be hearing echoes of that ancient disaster, filtered through thousands of years, but still carrying the memory of the day the Black Sea was born and an entire world drowned. Now, forget wooden shipwrecks for a moment. Forget everything you think you know about underwater archaeology, because what's sitting on the Black Sea floor isn't supposed to exist. It breaks every rule we thought we understood about preservation and decay. 2 miles down, in water so depleted of oxygen that bacteria can't survive, there are ships. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, possibly thousands. Wooden vessels that sank centuries ago, millennia ago, and they didn't rot. They didn't collapse. They didn't disappear into sediment and organic mush like every other shipwreck in every other ocean on Earth. They just sit there, perfectly preserved, waiting. The first hint came in 1999. A team of marine archaeologists led by Robert Ballard, the same guy who found the Titanic, was surveying the Black Sea floor using deep water ROVs. They were looking for evidence of the ancient flood, mapping submerged coastlines and river valleys. What they found instead was something that shouldn't have been possible: a Byzantine trading ship, over 1,500 years old. Sitting upright on the seafloor, mast still standing, hull intact, cargo amphoras still stacked in the hold exactly as they'd been loaded when Constantinople was the centre of the world. The team couldn't believe what they were seeing. Wooden ships don't survive like this. Wood is organic. It decays. In normal ocean conditions, wooden shipwrecks are consumed by marine organisms within decades, maybe centuries at most. The famous Mary Rose, Henry VIII's warship, spent 437 years underwater and was reduced to a fragile shell that required years of conservation just to display. But this Byzantine vessel looked like it had sunk last week. The secret was the anoxic zone. Below about 150 meters, the Black Sea contains no oxygen. None. It's one of the largest anoxic water bodies on Earth, a consequence of that ancient flood that turned a freshwater lake into a stratified sea. The heavy salt water that poured in from the Mediterranean settled at the bottom, and because there's no mixing, no circulation, the deep water became a biological dead zone. No oxygen means no bacteria. No bacteria means no decay. No decay means preservation that would make Egyptian mummification look primitive. The discovery set off a gold rush, not for treasure, but for knowledge. Because if one ship survived, how many others were down there? The Black Sea has been one of the world's busiest maritime highways for at least 5,000 years. Greek traders, Roman merchants, Byzantine fleets, medieval Genoese colonies, Ottoman naval vessels. Thousands upon thousands of ships had crossed these waters. How many had sunk? How many were preserved? The answer started coming in 2017. A team from the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology project began systematic surveys using advanced sonar and underwater photography. What they found rewrote naval history overnight. 65 shipwrecks in a single survey area. 65 vessels spanning from the Byzantine era back to ancient Greece and even earlier. Each one preserved in stunning detail. And one of them, one particular vessel, changed everything. It was lying at a depth of about 2,000 meters. The ROV's cameras illuminated it slowly, revealing details that made archaeologists literally gasp when they saw the footage. A Greek trading vessel, based on the design, definitely classical period. Pottery in the hold confirmed it. 2,400 years old. From the time of Plato and Aristotle, when Athens ruled the eastern Mediterranean and Greek colonies dotted the Black Sea coast. But here's what made grown archaeologists cry. The ship was complete, not partially preserved, not reconstructable from fragments, complete. The mast was still standing, rope rigging still attached. The steering oars were in place. Rowing benches where the crew had sat were intact. Ceramic jars in the hold were still sealed. The hull planking showed tool marks from the craftsmen who had built it 2,400 years ago. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. Every other ancient ship we'd found had been broken, collapsed, scattered. We had to reconstruct ancient vessels from paintings on pottery, from written descriptions, from educated guesses based on fragmentary remains. But this ship was a time capsule. It showed us exactly how ancient Greeks built their merchant vessels, confirmed details that scholars had debated for decades, and revealed features nobody had even imagined. The vessel matched almost perfectly a ship depicted on an ancient Greek vase called the Siren vase, painted around 480 BCE. For years, scholars had assumed the vase painting was stylized, artistic rather than technical. But here was the actual ship, and the ancient artist had gotten it exactly right. The Greeks knew how to paint what they saw, but this vessel, as incredible as it was, wasn't even the oldest. Deeper surveys found ships that pushed maritime history back even further. Vessels that predated classical Greece, that came from periods we'd thought were too primitive for serious seafaring. There were Bronze Age ships, 3,000, maybe 3,500 years old. From the time of the Trojan War, if that war actually happened. These weren't simple fishing boats or coastal traders. These were deep-water vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo across open sea. They had sophisticated hull designs, reinforced keels, multiple masts. This was advanced naval architecture from a period we'd thought was barely capable of building rafts. The implications were staggering. Ancient peoples weren't just hugging coastlines, island hopping, staying in sight of land. They were crossing open water, navigating by stars, understanding currents and winds well enough to undertake voyages that would terrify most modern sailors. The Black Sea was a Bronze Age highway, connecting cultures from Anatolia to the Caucasus, from Greece to the Pontic steppes. Some vessels went back even further, ships that might be 4,000, even 5,000 years old. From the Neolithic, the Late Stone Age, periods when humans were supposedly just figuring out agriculture and settled life. But here they were, building ocean-going vessels, establishing trade networks, creating maritime cultures that rivaled anything from later periods. What were they trading? The preserved cargoes tell us. Grain from the Pontic steppes, the breadbasket of the ancient world, wine and olive oil from Greek colonies, copper and tin for bronze making, amber from the Baltic coming down ancient trade routes, obsidian from Anatolia, valued for its razor-sharp edges, salt fish, dried for long-term storage, luxury goods, pottery, jewellery, the small valuable items that made long-distance trade profitable, but also slaves. The ancient Black Sea economy ran partly on human trafficking. Greek colonies would trade manufactured goods to steppe peoples for captives taken in tribal warfare. Those captives would be shipped across the Black Sea to Mediterranean markets. Some of these ships might be ancient slave vessels, carrying human cargo in their holds. Which brings us to the most haunting discoveries. The human remains, not on every ship. The anoxic zone preserves wood perfectly, but bodies are different. Organic tissue decays even without bacteria, just more slowly. Bones can survive, sometimes, and occasionally, very occasionally, the archaeologists find them. A skeleton in a Byzantine merchant ship, still wearing the leather belt he died in. Analysis of bone chemistry suggests he was from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, probably a professional sailor who'd spent his whole life on ships. He drowned when his vessel went down in a storm, probably around 1100 CE. He was about 35 years old. Another set of remains in an earlier vessel, this one possibly Roman era. Two individuals found together in what might have been the captain's quarters. DNA analysis suggests they were related, possibly father and son. They died together when their ship sank, maybe hit by a sudden squall, maybe holed by rocks in an unfamiliar harbour. They'd been carrying a cargo of wine amphoras from somewhere on the southern coast, probably heading to Greek colonies in what's now Ukraine. Each skeleton is a person. Someone with a name we'll never know, a life we can only imagine. They had families who mourned them, children who waited for a ship that never returned. The ships are their tombs now, magnificent and terrible, preserving the moment of their deaths across millennia. But here's what really keeps archaeologists up at night. These 65 ships were found in a relatively small survey area, maybe 2,000 square kilometres. The Black Sea covers over 400,000 square kilometres. If you scale up the discovery rate, the math becomes almost unbelievable. There might be more than 10,000 preserved shipwrecks down there, maybe more. A vast cemetery of vessels spanning 5,000 years of maritime history, Greek triremes with their 3 banks of oars, Roman grain haulers carrying Egyptian wheat to Constantinople, Byzantine warships armed with Greek fire, medieval cogs from Genoese trading colonies, Ottoman galleys from the height of the empire. Every major naval power in European and Middle Eastern history sailed these waters. Everyone lost ships, and every ship that sank into the anoxic zone became a time capsule, a perfect snapshot of maritime technology from that era. We haven't even scratched the surface. Current technology can survey, can photograph, can document, but actually excavating these sites, bringing artifacts up from 2,000 meters down, that's incredibly expensive, technically challenging, and raises serious ethical questions about disturbing what are essentially underwater graveyards. Some ships have been down there so long that they've become their own ecosystems. The oxygenated water above the anoxic zone supports life, and the shipwrecks create artificial reefs. Fish shelter in ancient hulls. Shells grow on wood that was cut when Rome ruled the Mediterranean. But the preservation won't last forever. The Black Sea is changing. Climate change is affecting water temperature and circulation. Some scientists worry that the anoxic layer might be destabilizing, that oxygen might begin mixing into the deep water. If that happens, bacteria will move in, and within decades these miraculous time capsules will rot away like any other shipwreck. We're in a race against time. We need to survey, document, study these vessels before they're lost again, this time forever. Each ship is a library of information about ancient technology, trade, daily life, the human experience of crossing dangerous waters in wooden vessels held together with hope and skill. The ancient mariners who sailed these ships didn't know they were part of history. They were just trying to make a living, transport cargo, get home safely to their families. But their vessels are now among the most important archaeological discoveries of the 21st century, rewriting our understanding of ancient seafaring and connecting us directly to the lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. Somewhere down there in the darkness, more ships are waiting, more stories, more evidence of human courage and tragedy and the eternal human drive to cross horizons and see what's on the other side. The Black Sea keeps its secrets well, but slowly, ship by ship, we're learning to read them. Here's where things get really interesting. Because while scientists were mapping drowned coastlines and finding preserved settlements under the Black Sea, scholars in dusty libraries were pulling out some very old texts, and suddenly archaeology and mythology started having a conversation they'd been avoiding for centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh. If you haven't read it, you should. It's one of the oldest written stories in human history, composed in ancient Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago. But the story it tells is much, much older, passed down through generations of oral tradition before anyone thought to write it down on clay tablets. And right in the middle of this epic adventure tale about a legendary king, there's a flood story. Not just any flood, a catastrophic deluge that destroys the world. In the story, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the gods that a great flood is coming. He's told to build a boat, a massive vessel sealed with pitch and tar. He's instructed to bring aboard his family, craftsmen to preserve essential skills, and animals, breeding pairs to repopulate the earth after the waters recede. The flood comes. It's described in vivid, terrifying detail. Water rising for 6 days and 7 nights. The storm so violent that even the gods are frightened by what they have unleashed. Everything drowns. Every city, every field, every living thing except what's on the boat. Then the waters recede. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test whether the land has dried. First a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which also returns. Finally a raven, which doesn't come back because it's found land. The world begins again. Sound familiar? It should. because the biblical story of Noah is essentially the same narrative, same basic structure, same key details, same theological purpose. One righteous man warned by the divine, one boat, one family, animals saved in pairs, birds sent out to test for land. The parallels are so exact that scholars have known for over a century that one story must have influenced the other, or more likely, both stories come from the same much older source. But here's what nobody could explain. Where did the original story come from? Floods happen all the time. Rivers overflow, storms bring heavy rains. Why would one flood become the defining catastrophe story for dozens of cultures across thousands of years? Why would people remember it so vividly that they kept telling the story for millennia, adding religious meaning and moral lessons but always keeping the core details intact? Then geologists started reconstructing what happened at the Black Sea 7,600 years ago, and suddenly the story made sense. Not metaphorical sense, literal sense. Think about it. You're living in a farming village on the shore of a freshwater lake. Your people have been there for generations. The lake provides fish, the surrounding land is fertile, life is good. Then one day you hear a sound, a distant roar that gets louder every hour. By evening you can see it on the horizon, a wall of water, not rising slowly like a normal flood, exploding across the landscape like something alive and angry. You grab what you can, your family, maybe some animals if there's time, you run. Behind you, the water is consuming everything, your home, your fields, your entire world, disappearing under waves that don't stop coming, day after day after day. For months, maybe a year, the water keeps rising. The lake you knew becomes a sea. Everything you knew is gone, drowned, lost forever beneath water that tastes like salt instead of fresh. You survive. Somehow. You make it to higher ground. You rebuild. But you never forget. And you tell your children, and they tell their children, and the story spreads. Because you weren't the only survivors. There were settlements all around the old lake. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, all experiencing the same catastrophe at the same time, all fleeing to different refuges, all carrying the same traumatic memory. Within a few generations, the story would start changing. Details would shift. The catastrophe that took months would collapse in memory into a few dramatic days. The practical reason for saving animals you needed livestock to restart your farm would gain religious significance. The refugees who escaped in boats would become a single heroic figure, one man wise enough to prepare. But the core would remain. The water came. The world drowned. Only those who got on boats survived. This is how traumatic events become mythology. And the Black Sea flood wasn't unique. It was just the most dramatic example in a region that experienced multiple catastrophic floods during the early Holocene. The Mediterranean basin has a complicated geological history. Sea levels were rising everywhere as the Ice Age ended. Glacial lakes were breaking through natural dams and flooding downstream valleys. Underground aquifers were collapsing, creating massive sinkholes that swallowed entire settlements. The same process that flooded the Black Sea happened at least twice before in the Mediterranean itself. Around 14,000 years ago, Lake Agassiz in North America burst through its ice dam and sent so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it disrupted ocean currents and triggered a temporary return to Ice Age conditions. This event would have caused massive flooding around coastal communities in Europe and the Near East. Around 6,000 years ago, another catastrophic flood hit the region, when the Mediterranean broke through into what's now the Sahara Desert, filling a series of massive lakes that later dried up again. Evidence for this event comes from geological surveys showing ancient shorelines hundreds of miles inland from the current coast. Some researchers think the flooding of the Black Sea might have triggered a chain reaction. All that water pouring through the Bosphorus had to go somewhere. Sea levels in the Mediterranean would have risen slightly, maybe just a few inches, but enough to overflow river deltas and flood coastal settlements. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Communities that had lived by the sea for generations suddenly found their homes underwater, and unlike a river flood that recedes after a few days or weeks, these floods were permanent. The sea level wasn't going back down. Your land was gone forever. This helps explain why flood myths are so widespread. It's not that every culture experienced the exact same catastrophe. It's that every culture around the Mediterranean and Black Sea experienced related catastrophes during the same general period. Between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, rising sea levels and geological instability created a perfect storm of flooding events. Each culture preserved its own version of the story, adding local details and cultural interpretations, but all remembering the same basic truth. The water came and took the old world away. The Greek story of Deucalion, the Roman tale of the flood that only Deucalion and Pyrrha survived, the Sumerian myth of Ziusudra, the Akkadian story of Atrahasis, Hindu texts describing the Matsya avatar saving Manu from a great deluge. Even cultures far from the Mediterranean have flood stories. The Aboriginal Australians have traditions of the sea rising and drowning coastal lands, which makes sense because the same post-Ice Age sea level rise that flooded the Black Sea also flooded vast areas of the Australian continental shelf. But the Mediterranean and Near Eastern stories are different. They're more specific, more detailed, and they all share elements that match what we know about the Black Sea event. The sudden onset, the complete destruction, the survival of a few in boats, the religious or moral framework suggesting the flood was divine punishment. This last element is particularly interesting because it reveals something about how humans process trauma. When catastrophe strikes, we need it to mean something. Random geological events that kill thousands are harder to accept than divine judgment that makes sense within our cultural framework. So, the survivors didn't just remember the flood, they interpreted it. They added meaning. They turned catastrophe into mythology. And here's the thing, they were right to preserve these stories because embedded in the mythology is real information. Archaeologists working on the Black Sea were initially skeptical of using flood myths as research guides. Seemed unscientific, like taking fairy tales seriously, but then they started finding settlements at exactly the depth predicted by the flood. Hypothesis. They found preservation that only made sense if cities had been suddenly inundated by salt water. They found evidence of rapid abandonment consistent with catastrophic flooding. The myths weren't just stories, they were memories, imperfect memories certainly, distorted by millennia of retelling, but memories nonetheless. This creates a fascinating problem for researchers. How do you separate fact from fiction in ancient texts? How do you know which details reflect real events and which are religious or narrative additions? The answer is you use multiple lines of evidence: archaeology, geology, genetics, linguistics, and yes, mythology. When they all point in the same direction, you're probably onto something real. The debate continues. Some researchers think the Black Sea flood was the single event that inspired all Near Eastern flood myths. Others argue for multiple floods contributing to a composite cultural memory. Some think we're overinterpreting coincidental similarities between unrelated stories. But the archaeological evidence from the Black Sea keeps getting stronger. Every expedition finds more preserved settlements, more evidence of sudden abandonment, more indications that something catastrophic happened there at exactly the time when flood myths start appearing in the historical record. What we're witnessing is the birth of historical memory, the moment when human societies became complex enough to preserve accurate information across dozens of generations. Not through writing, that came later, but through oral tradition, through stories told around fires, passed from grandparents to grandchildren, refined and retold until they took on the power of sacred texts. These weren't primitive peoples inventing fantasies. These were survivors preserving vital information about the dangers of their world, warning future generations that the sea could rise, that water could destroy everything, that preparation and respect for natural forces meant the difference between survival and extinction. And we're still telling the stories, still remembering, still fascinated by the idea that somewhere beneath the waves lies evidence of our ancestors' greatest catastrophe. The drowned cities of the Black Sea aren't just archaeological sites. They're proof that mythology isn't always myth. Sometimes it's history, traumatic, catastrophic, world-changing history that refused to be forgotten. But here's the thing about the Black Sea's drowned world. We've barely scratched the surface, or rather, barely scratched the sea floor. The sites discovered so far, the preserved ships, the submerged settlements, the ancient shorelines frozen in time, they're just the beginning. What lies beneath represents maybe 1%, possibly less, of what's actually down there. We're standing at the edge of the greatest archaeological frontier on Earth, and the tools we're developing to explore it are changing everything. Right now, as you're listening to this, engineers in laboratories across Europe and North America are designing the next generation of underwater archaeological robots. Not the clunky ROVs of the past, but autonomous AI-powered systems capable of mapping, analyzing, and even excavating submerged sites without direct human control. These machines use LIDAR, sonar, and photogrammetry simultaneously, creating three-dimensional models of underwater structures so detailed you can count individual stones in ancient walls. They can stay down for months at a time, powered by wave action or underwater currents, systematically surveying thousands of square miles of seafloor that would take human divers decades to explore. Some of these robots are being equipped with what researchers call soft robotic manipulators, artificial hands made of flexible materials that can handle delicate artifacts without crushing them. Imagine a machine that can excavate a 7,000-year-old clay pot with the same care as a human archaeologist, but at depths where humans can't survive, in darkness so complete that the concept of vision becomes meaningless. That technology exists now. It's being tested in the Black Sea as we speak, and the AI capabilities are getting genuinely wild. Machine learning algorithms trained on millions of images of archaeological sites can now identify patterns invisible to human eyes. They can spot the subtle geometric signatures of human construction in sonar data, distinguishing ancient walls from natural rock formations with accuracy that exceeds human experts. They can predict where settlements are most likely to be found based on ancient environmental conditions, topography, and proximity to resources. Feed these systems satellite data, historical climate records, and known archaeological sites, and they'll generate probability maps showing you exactly where to look for undiscovered cities. But the really revolutionary technology isn't robots or AI. It's something called environmental DNA analysis. Scientists have figured out how to extract microscopic fragments of genetic material from seafloor sediments and use them to reconstruct ancient ecosystems. They can tell you what plants were growing near a site 8,000 years ago, what animals people were hunting, what crops they were cultivating, even what diseases they were dying from, all from a handful of mud pulled up from the depths. Combine that with the latest isotope analysis techniques, and you can reconstruct individual life histories. A single tooth from a skeleton can tell you where someone was born, where they travelled, what they ate at different times in their life, even what kinds of stress they experienced. We're approaching the point where we can write biographical sketches of people who died 9,000 years ago. That's not archaeology anymore. That's resurrection through science. But none of this technology matters if we can't get access to the sites. And that's where things get complicated, politically complicated, geopolitically complicated in ways that make ancient history collide with modern territorial disputes. The Black Sea is surrounded by 6 countries: Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Georgia. Each one claims territorial waters extending out from its coastline, and many of the most promising archaeological sites sit right on the boundaries between these zones, or worse, in contested waters where multiple countries claim jurisdiction. The tensions around Crimea aren't just about modern strategic interests. They're also about who controls access to some of the most significant underwater archaeological sites in the world. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 didn't just shift political boundaries, it shifted archaeological control. Sites that Ukrainian researchers had been studying for years suddenly became inaccessible to them. Russian institutions took over the research, but international sanctions made it nearly impossible for them to collaborate with Western scientists. Potential discoveries get caught in bureaucratic tangles that have nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with power politics. And it's not just Russia and Ukraine. Turkey controls the Bosphorus Strait, the only connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Any international research expedition has to pass through Turkish waters, navigate Turkish regulations, get Turkish permits. That gives Turkey enormous influence over who can research what and where. Sometimes that works in archaeology's favour. Turkey has protected certain sites from commercial exploitation. Other times it creates frustrating delays and access restrictions that slow research to a crawl. Bulgaria and Romania have their own priorities, their own archaeological institutions that sometimes cooperate with international teams and sometimes compete with them. Georgia and Russia have their own territorial disputes that make collaborative research in certain areas basically impossible. The result is a patchwork of archaeological knowledge with huge gaps that exist purely because of modern borders and ancient grudges. But there's a bigger problem than politics, a more urgent threat that's ticking away like a countdown timer on humanity's ability to study these sites at all. Climate change. And not in the way you might think. The Black Sea is warming. Average water temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree Celsius over the past 30 years. That might not sound like much, but it's enough to alter the delicate chemical balance that has preserved these sites for millennia. Remember, the anoxic layer, that zone of zero oxygen water that's kept wooden ships and organic materials from decaying, it's not static. It moves. It rises and falls based on temperature, salinity, and ocean currents. As the Black Sea warms, that boundary is shifting. In some areas, it's moving deeper, exposing sites that were preserved for thousands of years to oxygen-rich water for the first time since they were submerged. And once that happens, the decay clock starts ticking. Wooden structures that looked perfect last decade are beginning to show signs of deterioration. Ships that survived intact for 2,500 years are developing soft spots, structural weaknesses. Marine organisms that couldn't survive in the anoxic zone are moving into newly oxygenated areas, boring into timbers, colonizing artifacts, accelerating the destruction. We're literally watching preservation zones disappear in real time. And the warming isn't uniform, it's creating new currents, shifting sediment patterns, changing the way seafloor sediments accumulate and erode. Some sites are getting buried under fresh sediment which might actually protect them, but others are being eroded, exposed, scattered by currents that didn't exist a generation ago. Ancient walls are collapsing. Artifact layers are being stripped away and dispersed across the seafloor. Sea level rise compounds the problem. Not because it's flooding new areas, the Black Sea's level is controlled by the Bosphorus Strait, not global ocean levels. But because changing water levels alter current patterns, salinity gradients, and the distribution of the anoxic layer. Models predict that within 50 to 100 years, many of the sites we know about will be in significantly different preservation states than they are today. Some might be better preserved, most will be worse, all will be different. Then there's the commercial threat. Natural gas. The Black Sea sits on top of massive natural gas reserves, billions of cubic meters of methane trapped in rock layers beneath the seafloor. Multiple countries are racing to exploit these reserves, drilling exploratory wells, conducting seismic surveys, planning extraction infrastructure. And they're doing it in exactly the areas where the most important archaeological sites are located, because ancient peoples built their settlements in the same geologically stable coastal areas that are now ideal for offshore drilling platforms. The international legal framework is a mess. Offshore drilling is regulated by a completely different set of laws than archaeological preservation. In most Black Sea nations, energy companies only have to conduct minimal archaeological surveys before beginning operations. Minimal means a quick sonar pass to make sure there aren't any obvious ancient structures in the immediate drilling area. If they don't see anything obvious, they can proceed. Never mind that the most interesting sites are often buried under sediment. Never mind that drilling operations can damage sites hundreds of meters away through vibrations, sediment displacement and chemical contamination. There have been cases, documented but unpublicized, where drilling operations damaged or destroyed significant archaeological sites. A sunken Byzantine merchant vessel, location deliberately kept secret to protect it, was buried under drill cuttings from a nearby well. An ancient harbour structure was fractured by seismic testing. These losses barely made the news. Energy extraction trumps archaeological preservation almost every time, so there's a race happening right now. Archaeologists are racing to survey, document and excavate the most important sites before they're destroyed by climate change, eroded by shifting currents, or obliterated by commercial development. But they're racing with inadequate funding against political obstacles, using technology that's still being developed, working in one of the most difficult environments on Earth, and they're running out of time. But here's what keeps archaeologists working despite these challenges: the certainty that what we've found so far is nothing compared to what's still waiting. The Black Sea shoreline has been rising and falling for millions of years, through dozens of ice age cycles, through countless human epochs. The 7,500-year-old settlements we've discovered might be dramatic, but they're just the most recent layer. What about the people who lived on the Black Sea coast during the last ice age, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today? Their settlements would be under even deeper water, even harder to find, but they'd be there, preserved by the same anoxic conditions, waiting for technology to advance enough to locate and study them. What about the maritime cultures that must have existed during earlier warm periods, when the Black Sea was connected to the Mediterranean through different channels, when its ecology was completely different? What about the possibility, tantalizing and still unproven, that some of the very oldest human settlements, the first experiments in agriculture, the first permanent villages, might lie beneath the Black Sea, drowned by floods that happened so long ago they're beyond the reach of radiocarbon dating? Machine learning models analysing seafloor topography have identified thousands of potential archaeological sites in the Black Sea. Thousands! And we've excavated fewer than a dozen. The statistical probability suggests that we haven't yet found the most significant sites. The biggest settlements, the oldest remains, the key pieces of evidence that would rewrite our understanding of early civilization, they're down there. We just haven't looked in the right places yet. Which brings up the final question, the one that keeps ethicists and archaeologists arguing late into the night. Should we even be disturbing these sites? These are graveyards, after all, places where people lived and died, communities that were destroyed by rising waters, their possessions, their homes, their bones, all resting in the darkness. Do we have the right to drag them into the light, to catalogue them, study them, put them in museums? Some argue no, that these sites should be designated as underwater heritage zones and left untouched. That our curiosity, however scientifically motivated, doesn't justify disturbing the dead. That there's something fundamentally disrespectful about treating ancient tragedies as research opportunities. Others argue that preservation through study is the only way to give meaning to these ancient disasters. That understanding how our ancestors lived, what they built, how they survived, how they failed, that's honouring them, not exploiting them. That knowledge extracted from the deep helps us understand our own origins, our own vulnerabilities, our own futures. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. We need to study these sites. The knowledge they contain is irreplaceable, but we need to do it respectfully, carefully, with full awareness that we're dealing with human lives, not just archaeological data. We need international agreements protecting significant sites from commercial exploitation. We need funding for research that isn't tied to national interest or political boundaries. We need to move fast enough to preserve knowledge before it's lost forever, but slow enough to do it right. Because whatever we decide, the clock is ticking. The Black Sea is changing. The sites are degrading. And the window for recovering this knowledge is closing faster than most people realise. What lies beneath the Black Sea isn't just history. It's the story of how humans learned to live in one place, to farm, to build cities, to become civilised. And that story is drowning all over again, this time in warming water and bureaucratic inertia and commercial indifference. The question isn't whether we'll lose these sites. We will. The question is how much we'll learn before they're gone. So here we are, at the end of our journey into the drowned world of the Black Sea. 8,000 years of human history, gone in a matter of months. Cities swallowed, people scattered, an entire civilization erased so completely that it became legend. But what does it actually mean? What are we supposed to take away from all this? Start with the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't some unique catastrophe, some once-and-forever cosmic accident. This was just climate doing what climate does. Sea levels rise, glaciers melt, water finds new paths, and when it does, civilizations that have existed for thousands of years can disappear in a single human lifetime. The people living around that freshwater lake in 5600 BCE had no warning. Their ancestors had lived there for millennia. They had developed farming, built permanent settlements, created trade networks. They had every reason to believe their world was stable, permanent, the way things would always be. Then the Mediterranean found a weak point in the Bosphorus Ridge, and everything they knew ceased to exist. We like to think of human civilization as this permanent thing, this inevitable march of progress. We build cities that we imagine will stand for centuries. We create cultures and assume they'll endure. But the Black Sea tells a different story. It says that everything we build exists at the mercy of forces vastly larger than ourselves. Those drowned cities aren't ancient history. They're a preview, a reminder that the ground beneath our feet, the coastlines we've built our cities on, the climate systems that make agriculture possible, none of it is guaranteed. None of it is permanent. But here's the thing. The flood destroyed a civilization, yes, but it didn't destroy the people. Most of them survived. They fled inland, carrying whatever they could salvage. They settled in new territories, rebuilding their lives from scratch, and they told stories. Stories that became the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tale of Noah, flood myths that spread across dozens of cultures. The trauma was so profound that it literally shaped human mythology for the next 8,000 years. That's resilience. That's the human capacity to survive catastrophe and transform it into meaning. The archaeologists working in the Black Sea today, the ones sending robots into the anoxic depths, they're not just recovering artifacts, they're recovering evidence of that survival. Every preserved ship, every drowned building, every scattered tool, they're proof that humans can endure the worst nature throws at them and come out the other side. Changed, traumatized, forced to adapt, but still here, still building, still hoping, and we're only seeing the beginning. The Black Sea's anoxic waters have preserved 8,000 years of maritime history in near-perfect condition. Every year brings new discoveries, new sights, new mysteries. That Bronze Age ship lying intact at 2,000 meters depth, still waiting for technology advanced enough to recover it without destroying it. The dozens of settlements that sonar has detected but no one has investigated yet. The trade routes, the migration patterns, the connections between cultures that we're only starting to map. We've barely scratched the surface. Literally, the Black Sea floor covers 436,000 square kilometers, and we've investigated maybe a few hundred square meters in any detail. Imagine what's still down there. What other drowned cities are waiting? What other stories are preserved in the mud? This is what makes archaeology thrilling. We think we know our history. We think we understand where we came from. Then someone drops a camera into dark water and finds an entire world we'd forgotten existed. A world that challenges our assumptions, that fills in gaps we didn't even know were there. The Black Sea did that. It took flood myths we thought were just stories and showed us they were memories. Real events, preserved through oral tradition across millennia. What other lost worlds are out there? What other catastrophes are preserved at the bottoms of other seas, in deserts that were once fertile, beneath jungles that have swallowed ancient cities? How much of our own history have we simply forgotten? Before you go, take a second to like this video if you enjoyed diving into the deep with us. Comment below and let us know where you're listening from. And if you want more stories of lost worlds and forgotten peoples, subscribe. There are so many more mysteries waiting to be explored. The drowned cities of the Black Sea aren't an ending. They're a beginning, a reminder that history isn't fixed, isn't complete. It's constantly being revised, constantly being discovered, and the more we learn about our past, the better we understand what we're capable of. Both the disasters we can survive and the worlds we can lose. Sleep well, and tomorrow, when you wake up, remember that beneath the waves, in the darkness, entire civilizations are waiting to tell their stories. All we have to do is listen,